Grace Whitman had exactly $4 in the tip jar on her cart that morning, and she was about to give away the last plate of food she had left to a man she had never seen before in her life. She didn't know his name. She didn't know where he had come from, or why he was standing in a parking lot in a wrinkled shirt with no wallet in his hand. All she knew was that he looked hungry and tired, and something about the way he stood there, quiet and still, while the rest of the world moved around him, told her he needed that plate more than she needed the money it would have brought her. So she handed it to him anyway. She had no way of knowing that this one decision, made in less than 30 seconds on an ordinary Tuesday, was about to unravel everything she thought she understood about her own life. She had no way of knowing that in a few short weeks, a black car would pull up beside her cart, that a set of iron gates would open for her that had never opened for anyone like her before, and that she would stand inside a house so large she could not see where it ended, trying to understand how a free meal had led her there. She had no way of knowing any of it. She just knew a stranger was hungry, and she had food to give. What Grace did not know that morning was that the man standing in front of her was not simply hungry. He was one of the wealthiest men in the entire country, a man whose name appeared in headlines and financial reports, a man surrounded on any ordinary day by assistants and security and people whose only job was to keep strangers away from him. And yet on this particular morning, he was standing completely alone, unrecognized, untraceable, waiting to see what an ordinary woman would do when she believed no one of importance was watching her at all. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why that single plate of food changed the rest of Grace Whitman's life, and why a man with more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes chose her, out of every person in that city, to test something he had been quietly testing for years. This is not a story about luck. This is a story about who we choose to become when we believe nothing is being asked of us in return, and it is a story that millions of people needed to hear, because somewhere along the way, most of us forget how much a single moment of kindness can actually be worth. To understand what happened to Grace, you first have to understand who she was before any of this began, and who the man standing in front of her cart really was, because neither of them were who the other assumed. Grace was 38 years old, raising 2 children on her own, running a food cart 6 days a week on a street where most people barely looked up long enough to say thank you. The man in front of her, the one she would later learn was named William Hartley, had built one of the largest companies in the country from almost nothing, and had spent the last several years doing something none of his employees, none of his family, and none of the news outlets that covered him had ever discovered. There are 3 questions this story is going to answer, and I want you to hold on to them, because the answers are not what you expect. Why was a man like William Hartley standing at a street cart with no security, no driver, and no way for anyone to know who he really was? What did Grace say to him in that parking lot that he had never heard another human being say to him before? Not once, in over 20 years of being one of the richest men in America. And what did he decide to do next? A decision that would not only change Grace's life, but would reveal a pattern he had kept hidden from almost everyone who thought they knew him best. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand why William was standing in that parking lot at all, you have to go back further than that Tuesday morning. You have to go back to the year he lost the one person who had ever fed him without asking for anything in return, and to a promise he made to himself afterward that almost no one alive knew he had kept. Grace had no idea any of that history existed behind the quiet, tired eyes of the stranger standing in front of her cart. She only knew he was hungry, and that morning, that was reason enough for her. Grace Whitman grew up in a small brick house on the south side of Atlanta, in a neighborhood where everybody knew everybody, and where her grandmother, a woman named Ruth, ran a kitchen that never really closed. Ruth had raised 4 children on a school cafeteria salary, and somehow, every single Sunday, there was room at her table for whoever showed up hungry, family or not. Grace remembered standing on a wooden stool at 6 years old, watching her grandmother stretch a pot of greens and cornbread to feed 12 people instead of 6, and asking her how there was always enough. Ruth had told her something Grace never forgot. She said, "Baby, there's always enough when you're willing to go without so somebody else doesn't have to." That lesson followed Grace into adulthood. Through nursing school she never finished because her mother got sick. Through a marriage that ended when her youngest was 2 years old. And into the food cart she built from a $2,000 loan and a recipe book that had belonged to Ruth. She named the cart after her grandmother, and she ran it the same way Ruth ran that kitchen, which meant there was always one extra plate made, every single day, for whoever needed it most and could not pay. Her regulars knew this about her. Her children knew this about her. It had never once made her rich, but it had never once made her ashamed either. Grace was 22 and 1 semester away from her nursing degree when her mother, Loretta, was diagnosed with a heart condition that required constant care no one else in the family could afford to provide. Grace remembered sitting beside her mother's hospital bed one evening, holding her hand while a machine beeped steadily beside them, and asking her, quietly, whether she should drop out to take care of her full time. Loretta had squeezed her hand and told her no, that she had not raised a daughter to give up her own future for someone else's ending. Grace withdrew from school anyway, 3 weeks later, and never told her mother the truth about why, because some decisions, she believed, were not meant to be argued over twice. Loretta passed 18 months later, and Grace carried both the loss and the choice with her for years afterward, never quite able to separate the two. It was at Loretta's bedside, in one of their last real conversations, that her mother made her promise something Grace had never repeated to anyone outside her own family. Loretta told her that she did not care whether Grace ever became a nurse or ever became anything the world called successful, as long as she stayed the kind of person who noticed when somebody else was hurting and did something about it, the way Ruth always had. Grace promised her that she would, sitting there in a hospital room with a future she had just quietly given up, and it was a promise she thought about every single morning she made that extra plate, long before William Hartley ever walked into her line. By the time she was 38, Grace was raising Marcus, 14, and Destiny, 16, alone in a 2-bedroom apartment 11 miles from where she grew up, working 6 days a week, closing out most nights with barely enough left over to cover rent and the light bill. She was tired in a way that had settled into her bones, the kind of tired that does not go away with sleep. But she still made the extra plate. She still believed, the way her grandmother had taught her, that generosity was not something you waited to afford. It was something you decided on, every single morning, before you knew what the day was going to cost you. Grace was not alone in that neighborhood, even on her hardest days. 2 doors down from where she parked her cart, a woman named Rachel ran a small hair salon out of the front room of her house, and the two of them had known each other since Destiny and Rachel's youngest were in the same kindergarten class. Rachel was the person Grace called when the fryer acted up, when a customer stiffed her, when she needed someone to talk to who would not immediately try to fix the problem for her. Rachel used to tease Grace that she gave away more food than some restaurants sold, and Grace used to tell her that the day she stopped doing that was the day she would stop recognizing herself in the mirror. There was a regular named Otis, a retired postal worker in his 70s who had been coming to the cart nearly every weekday for 3 years, always ordering the same thing, always leaving the same modest tip. Grace had noticed months earlier that Otis had started skipping days, then skipping more of them, and when she asked him about it, he admitted quietly that his pension check had been stretched thinner since his wife's medication changed. From that point on, Grace found small ways to make his plate a little larger without ever mentioning it, the same way her grandmother used to feed people without turning it into a conversation about their circumstances. Money was tighter that particular season than it had been in years. The cart's old fryer had started failing without warning, and the repair estimate Grace received was nearly $800, money she did not have sitting anywhere. She spent 2 weeks patching it herself with parts. A mechanic friend of Rachel's found secondhand, working an hour earlier than usual most mornings, just to get the equipment running before customers arrived. She never once considered cutting the extra plate to save money, even though it would have been the easiest expense to remove. It was, in her mind, the only expense that was never actually optional. William Hartley's story began somewhere entirely different. in a house with more rooms than people to fill them, but it carried a similar wound underneath it. His mother, a woman named Eleanor, had died when he was 26 years old, only a handful of years after he had made his first real fortune. Eleanor had never once let money change the way she treated people. She had kept feeding neighbors long after her son could have bought the entire block, and she used to tell him that wealth only meant something if it made you more generous, not less. When she passed, William inherited more money than most countries generate in a year. What he did not inherit, at least not automatically, was her instinct for who deserved kindness, and who was only performing gratitude to get close to his wallet. In the years after Eleanor's death, William became a quieter, more guarded version of himself in public. But privately, he started doing something almost no one around him knew about. He began dressing down, driving nothing that drew attention, and walking into ordinary places completely unrecognized, just to watch how people treated him when they believed he had nothing to offer them. It had started as grief. Somewhere along the way, it had become a private ritual, almost a search, for the kind of person his mother had been. He had done this dozens of times over the years, in diners, in laundromats, in grocery store lines, and almost every single time, people had either ignored him or judged him for looking like he had nothing. Almost every time. 2 years before he ever walked into Grace's line, William had tried this same test at a small diner outside Cleveland, telling a waitress named Karen that he had left his wallet at home and asking if he could settle the bill later. Karen had looked him over, decided he did not look like the kind of man worth the risk, and told him plainly that the diner did not extend credit to strangers. William had left without protest, and it was only after a manager recognized him from a business magazine on his way out that Karen came running after him, suddenly apologetic, suddenly eager to comp the meal entirely. William paid in full anyway and never went back. A similar thing had happened in a laundromat outside Phoenix, where a man named Gary, folding towels at the machine beside him, spent 10 minutes complaining loudly about people who used the good dryers without exact change, clearly directing the comment at William, who had asked to borrow 75 cents. William gave the machine back without argument and finished his wash somewhere else. He never told Gary who he was, and Gary never found out, but the memory stayed with William longer than most of the others, a reminder of how easily people decided who deserved patience and who did not, based on almost nothing at all. His closest friend, a man named Daniel who had known him since business school, was one of the only people aware of these quiet tests, and Daniel had told him more than once that he was chasing something that no longer existed, that his mother had been one person in one specific life, and it was not fair to measure every stranger in America against her. William never fully disagreed with Daniel. He simply kept walking into diners and laundromats anyway, because some part of him needed to know the answer was not already decided. Every year, on the morning of the anniversary, before he ever started walking, William drove alone to the small cemetery outside the city where Eleanor was buried, without any of the staff who normally accompanied him anywhere he went. He never brought flowers, because his mother used to say flowers were money better spent on someone who could still taste a meal, and instead he brought nothing at all, just himself, standing quietly at a headstone that listed nothing about her wealth or her son's success, only her name and 2 dates that felt closer together every year he stood there. That particular morning, before he ever reached Grace's cart, he had stood at that headstone longer than usual, long enough that he arrived at where he was walking, already carrying more of her with him than he usually allowed himself to. There is one detail about that Tuesday morning you still do not know, and it is the detail that made William stop walking and stand at Grace's cart in the first place. Keep that in mind, because it matters more than it seems right now. And Grace, for her part, had no memory of a promise she made months earlier that had nothing to do with William at all, a promise she made to herself after a conversation with her daughter that would end up shaping exactly how she responded when a stranger told her he had no money to pay. William had been walking for almost 2 hours that morning, further than he had planned, in a part of the city he barely recognized despite having grown up less than 30 minutes away. He had left his phone in the car on purpose, the way he always did on these mornings, and by the time he reached Grace's cart, he was genuinely hungry, not performing hunger the way he sometimes worried he might be, testing people from a place of comfort rather than need. He stood in a short line behind two other customers, watching Grace work, noticing the way she greeted each person by name, the way she asked one older man about his hip, the way she remembered a woman's order before the woman had finished speaking. When it was his turn, William stepped up and told her, honestly, that he did not have his wallet on him. He offered to come back later to pay, fully expecting the answer he had received in every other version of this test he had run over the years, a polite no, a request that he step aside for paying customers, sometimes worse. Grace looked at him for a moment, the way she looked at most strangers.
Thank you so
Not
much.
with suspicion,
You are
but with the
very
same
welcome.
attention she gave everyone in that line. Then she reached for a container and started building the last plate she had left that morning, the same plate she made every single day and never sold. She told him something simple while she worked, not performed, not rehearsed for an audience, because as far as she knew, there was no audience. She told him that nobody eats less because somebody else eats today, and that he could come back and pay her whenever life allowed it, or not come back at all. It genuinely did not matter to her either way. She handed him the plate, along with a bottle of water she pulled from a small cooler under the cart, and she moved on to the next customer without waiting to see his reaction, the way she did every single time she made that extra plate. William stood there for a moment longer than he needed to. In 20 years of running this same quiet test on strangers across a dozen cities, no one had ever responded exactly like this, with no hesitation, no performance, no subtle expectation of being noticed or thanked for their generosity later. He walked away from that cart with a plate of food he'd barely tasted, because his mind was somewhere else entirely, replaying a version of his mother he had not seen reflected in another human being since the day she died. For nearly 2 weeks after that morning, nothing happened at all, and Grace genuinely forgot about the man in the wrinkled shirt, the way she forgot about most of the strangers she fed, because remembering every face was not something her life gave her room to do. She kept opening the cart at 6 in the morning, kept making the extra plate, kept closing out most nights, barely covering what the day had cost her. If anything had changed, it was something she could not name yet, a feeling more than a fact, the sense that someone had been watching her more closely than usual, though she could not have told you why she felt that way, or who. It started small. A woman she did not recognize came by twice in 1 week, ordered a plate, and asked more questions than a regular customer usually did, about how long Grace had been running the cart, whether she owned the equipment or leased it, whether she had ever thought about expanding. Grace answered politely, the way she answered most curious customers, without thinking much of it. Then a car she did not recognize, dark, quiet, expensive in a way that stood out on that block, began parking across the street some mornings, never long enough for Grace to get a clear look at who was inside, never obvious enough to feel like more than a coincidence, at first. Grace mentioned the car to Rachel first, sitting in the salon chair one evening while Rachel worked through a wash and set neither of them was really paying attention to. Rachel's first guess was that a landlord somewhere was scouting the block to buy it up, something that had happened 2 streets over the year before, displacing a barbershop that had been open for 30 years. Grace spent an uneasy weekend turning that possibility over, wondering what it would mean for the cart's spot if someone bought the corner out from under her, and Rachel, without meaning to, kept the worry alive by mentioning it again the following week, having heard a second-hand rumor at the salon that turned out to lead nowhere at all. At home, Marcus noticed his mother checking the street through the kitchen window more than usual, and when he asked her directly what was wrong, Grace found herself unable to explain a feeling that had no real evidence behind it. She told him it was probably nothing, the same thing she had been telling herself for days, though she noticed she had started double-checking the cart's lock at night, something she had not done in years. Destiny, more skeptical than either of them, suggested it might simply be an unmarked delivery vehicle for one of the newer businesses on the block, a theory that satisfied everyone for exactly 4 days, until the same car appeared again on a morning no deliveries were scheduled at all. By the second week, Grace mentioned it to her daughter Destiny, who was 17 and paid closer attention to things like this than her mother had time to. Destiny asked if anyone had approached her directly, if anyone had said anything strange, and Grace admitted that no one had, not really, just a feeling that would not leave her alone. Destiny half-joked that maybe her mother had finally caught the attention of a health inspector who could not make up his mind, and for a few days, that was the explanation Grace settled on, mostly because it was easier than sitting with the alternative, which was that she genuinely did not know what was happening or why. The truth arrived on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, the way most life-changing moments seem to, disguised as nothing in particular. One of Grace's regulars, a retired school teacher named Barbara, who read 3 newspapers a day out of habit, stopped by the cart holding her phone out, her face somewhere between shock and disbelief. She asked Grace if she recognized the man in the photo on her screen. Grace looked and felt something tighten in her chest, because she did recognize him, the same tired eyes, the same quiet way of standing, the man she had handed a free plate to weeks earlier without a second thought. Barbara told her his name, William Hartley. Grace had heard that name before, on the news, attached to numbers she could not fully picture in her mind, numbers with more zeros than she had ever needed to count in her life. For the rest of that day, Grace moved through her routine on autopilot, her mind circling the same handful of questions over and over. Why had a man with that kind of money been standing in her line with no wallet? Why had he let her believe he had nothing, when he had more than she would ever earn across every year she had left to work? She was not angry exactly, but she felt exposed in a way she could not fully explain, as though a private moment meant only for a stranger in need had somehow been something else entirely, something she had not agreed to be part of. That night, she told Destiny and Marcus what Barbara had shown her, and her son, only 14, asked the question that ended up mattering more than any of the others. He asked her if she would have given William the plate anyway, if she had known who he really was. Grace thought about that question longer than she expected to. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen, about the promise she had made to herself the year Marcus was born, that she would never let scarcity turn her into someone who measured kindness against what she might get back from it. She told her son the truth, which was yes, she would have given him the plate either way, because the plate was never about who William Hartley was. It was about who Grace Whitman had decided to be, long before that Tuesday morning ever happened. Answering Marcus that night pulled up a memory Grace had not thought about in almost a year, from a conversation she had with Destiny back when the cart's profits had been even thinner than they were now. Destiny had asked her mother, half frustrated and half heartbroken after a particularly hard month, why they kept giving food away for free when they barely had enough for themselves. Grace remembered sitting her daughter down that night and telling her that kindness was never about having enough, that it was about deciding, every single day, who you wanted to be regardless of what the day had already taken from you. She had promised Destiny then that she would never stop making that extra plate, no matter how difficult things became, because the day she stopped would be the day she stopped being her grandmother's granddaughter. Sitting with Marcus's question now, Grace realized that promise had already been tested weeks earlier, in a parking lot, without her ever knowing it. 3 days later, the same black car that had been parking across the street finally stopped in front of the cart during the morning rush, and William Hartley stepped out of it himself. No disguise this time, no wrinkled shirt, dressed the way the photos Barbara had shown her suggested he usually dressed. Several customers in line recognized him immediately, and a quiet kind of stunned silence moved through the small crowd gathered around Grace's cart. William walked directly to Grace, ignoring the attention gathering around him, and told her something she had not expected to hear. He told her that in over 20 years of testing strangers, exactly the way he had tested her, offering nothing, expecting to be turned away, she was the first person who had never once treated him differently once she learned the truth, because as far as he could tell, she had already decided how she was going to treat him before she ever knew there was a choice worth making. What William told Grace that morning went further than she expected, and it explained the strange weeks that came before it. He told her about his mother, Eleanor, about the kitchen she never closed, and about the promise he had made after she died, to keep testing the world in small, anonymous ways, hoping to find someone who reminded him of her. He told her he had done this in 9 different cities, more times than he could easily count, and that almost every single time, people had either turned him away or change their behavior the moment they learned who he was. Suddenly warmer, suddenly more attentive, in a way that told him everything he needed to know about what their kindness had actually been worth. Grace was different. Grace had already been the same person before and after the truth came out, and to William, that meant more than any amount of money could measure. He told her one more thing, something he had not planned to share with anyone that morning, let alone a stranger he had known for a matter of weeks. The Tuesday he first walked into her line happened to be the 12th anniversary of Eleanor's death, a date William marked every year not with flowers or a headstone visit, but by walking, alone and unrecognized, through parts of the city his mother would have known far better than the boardrooms he spent most of his life in now. He had not planned to end up at her cart specifically. He had simply kept walking longer than usual that day, further than he ever had on any of his previous tests, almost as if some part of him was searching harder than usual for exactly the kind of person his mother had been. The black car Grace had been watching from her window for 2 weeks, it turned out, belonged to a member of William's small research team, a woman named Catherine, who he had quietly asked to look into who was running the cart, not to investigate Grace so much as to make sure the offer he was building toward would actually fit the life she already had, rather than the life he assumed a stranger in her position might want. Catherine's questions about ownership and equipment had not been idle curiosity. They had been the beginning of a plan William had been assembling since the morning he walked away with a plate of food he barely tasted. He was not there simply to thank her, though he did, sincerely and at length, in front of everyone still standing in that morning line. He had come to make her an offer, one he explained carefully, without spectacle, because he told her he had learned over the years that grand gestures made for good headlines, but rarely made for good outcomes if they were not built with the actual person in mind. He wanted to fund a permanent restaurant for Grace, not a replacement for her cart, but an expansion of exactly what she had already built, a place with her grandmother Ruth's name still on the door, a kitchen where the tradition of the extra plate would not just continue, but would be written into the business itself as a standing promise to the neighborhood. He offered to cover her children's education completely, from that point forward, with no conditions attached beyond finishing what they started. And he offered her something else, something Grace had not expected at all, a standing partnership in a foundation he had quietly funded for years, one dedicated to finding and supporting other people across the country who were already doing what she had done, without recognition, without reward, simply because it was who they were. Grace did not answer him immediately, and she did not answer him that day at all. She told William, honestly, that this was not a decision she was going to make standing in the middle of a morning rush with half the block watching, and William, to her surprise, told her that was exactly the answer he had hoped for. He left her his direct number, told her to take whatever time she needed, and walked back to the car without pressing her further. That night, after William left her his number and drove away, Grace sat at her kitchen table with Marcus and Destiny and told them everything. The offer, the restaurant, the foundation, all of it laid out plainly, the way she had always tried to be with them. She expected excitement, and there was some, but what surprised her was the fear underneath it, coming mostly from Marcus, who asked her quietly whether accepting the money meant they would stop being who they were, whether people would start treating them differently, whether he would still be able to walk into the corner store without someone looking at him a certain way. Destiny, for her part, admitted she was scared of something else entirely, that the life they had built, hard as it had been, was at least a life she understood completely, and she did not know how to be afraid of something good, the same way she already knew how to survive something bad. Grace did not have easy answers for either of them that night, and she did not pretend to. She told Marcus that money could change plenty of things, but it could not change what she had already taught him about who deserved kindness and who did not, because that lesson had been decided in their family long before anyone offered them $1 for it. She told Destiny that being afraid of something good was allowed, that she had felt the same fear standing in that parking lot deciding whether to accept William's offer at all, and that the only way through fear like that was to keep doing the next right thing, the way Ruth always had. One plate, one decision, one morning at a time. The three of them sat at that table long after the conversation had technically ended, none of them quite ready to go to bed on an ordinary night that no longer felt ordinary at all. Grace spent the next 2 evenings talking it through, first with Rachel, who told her plainly that she would be a fool not to take it, and then with her pastor, a man she had trusted with harder decisions than this one over the years, who asked her a single question that stayed with her longer than any advice Rachel had given. He asked her whether taking William's help would change what she did with the extra plate, or only change how much easier it became to keep doing it. Grace realized, sitting in his office, that the answer to that question was the only thing that actually mattered to her. On the third morning, she called William herself. She stood there for a long moment before he arrived, the same way William had stood at her cart weeks earlier, turning the offer over in her mind one last time, thinking about her grandmother, about the $2,000 loan she had built the cart from, about every night she had closed out barely covering rent, and told herself it was still worth it. When he arrived and she finally spoke, she told William she would accept the restaurant and the partnership, but she wanted one condition of her own added to it. She wanted the extra plate, the one her grandmother had taught her to make every single day, written permanently into the restaurant's policy, so that no matter who owned it after her, no matter how successful it became, there would always be one meal made for whoever needed it most and could not pay. William agreed before she had even finished the sentence. Before either of them signed anything, William insisted Grace bring in her own lawyer, someone with no connection to him or his company, a decision that surprised her more than the offer itself had. He told her plainly that he had seen too many people accept help from wealthy benefactors only to lose control of what they had built within a few years, buried under terms they never fully understood until it was too late. Grace's lawyer, a woman named Catherine's colleague recommended through a nonprofit clinic downtown, spent nearly 3 weeks going through every clause, and the final agreement gave Grace full ownership of the restaurant, complete authority over the menu and the extra plate policy, and a clause stating that her grandmother's name could never be removed from the building, regardless of who managed it in the future. William signed without asking for a single change. The restaurant opened 8 months later, on the same street where the cart had stood for years, with Ruth's name above the door exactly as Grace had asked. The night before opening, Grace let herself into the empty restaurant alone, long after the contractors had gone home, and stood in the middle of a kitchen larger than any space she had ever cooked in. She had brought one thing with her that she had not shown anyone yet, a small tin box of her grandmother's handwritten recipe cards, softened at the edges from decades of use, and she sat on an overturned crate in the half-finished dining room and read through them one at a time, the way Ruth used to read them out loud while she cooked. She cried there, alone, for longer than she expected to, not from sadness exactly, but from the particular ache of wanting badly for someone who was gone to be able to see what their kitchen had become. She had told Otis about the restaurant 2 weeks before it opened, stopping by his apartment herself instead of waiting for him to come to the cart, because by then, his visits had grown even less frequent than before. Otis answered the door slower than he used to, and when Grace explained what had happened and what she was building, and told him plainly that there would always be a table waiting for him, whether he could pay or not, the old man sat down in his doorway and wept, something Grace had never once seen him do in 3 years of knowing him. He told her that her grandmother, wherever she was, must be prouder than words could hold, and Grace told him that Ruth would have said the same thing about anyone who kept showing up, day after day, the way he had for her. On opening night, Grace stood behind a real kitchen for the first time in her life, watching her son and daughter greet customers at the front, watching neighbors who had known her for years walk through a door that used to be a folding table on wheels. She thought about the version of herself who had handed a plate to a stranger without asking his name, and she understood something she tried to explain to a reporter who asked her, months later, whether she had any regrets about not recognizing William sooner. Grace told the reporter that recognizing him sooner would have changed nothing about what she did that morning, and that was exactly the point. The reward had never been the reason. It had simply been what happened to follow. Not everyone on the block responded to Grace's good fortune the way Rachel did. A few weeks after the restaurant opened, Grace overheard a version of herself being discussed at the corner store that she barely recognized, a rumor that she had known who William was all along. that the free plate had been a calculated move rather than a genuine one, that she had simply gotten lucky enough to be noticed by the right person at the right time. The comments stung more than she expected, mostly because they came from people she had fed herself, more than once, without ever asking their names either. Rachel told her not to waste energy defending herself to people who had never once seen her close out a register at midnight, wondering how she would cover rent. Grace decided, in the end, not to defend herself with words at all. She kept the extra plate policy exactly as she had promised, and within a few months, several of the same neighbors who had doubted her were the ones being quietly served that plate on hard weeks of their own, never announced, never mentioned publicly, the same way her grandmother had always done it. The rumors faded the way most rumors do, not because anyone apologized, but because the truth of how she actually ran the restaurant eventually spoke louder than the story people had told about her before they knew better. William, for his part, did not disappear from Grace's life the way wealthy benefactors sometimes do once the cameras move on to the next story. He returned to the restaurant quietly every few months, unannounced, sitting at the counter like any other customer, and Grace noticed something she had not expected to notice, that being around people who did not want anything from him seemed to be the only place he genuinely relaxed. She never treated those visits as anything more than a friend stopping by, and she suspected that was exactly why he kept coming back. The story of Grace Whitman and William Hartley eventually made its way into local news, and later national coverage, not because either of them sought the attention, but because a customer at the restaurant recognized William during one of his visits and could not help sharing it. When reporters asked Grace what she wanted people to take from her story, she gave an answer that stayed with a lot of the people who heard it. She said that kindness is not supposed to be a transaction you calculate the odds on before you commit to it, and that the moment you start asking whether someone deserves your generosity is usually the moment you have already stopped understanding what generosity is for. She said her grandmother taught her that there is always enough, as long as you are willing to go without so somebody else does not have to, and that lesson had never once failed her, long before William Hartley ever walked into her line. If this story moved you the way it moved us putting it together, we would love to know which part stayed with you the longest, and if you believe small moments like this one still happen every single day in ordinary places, tell us about it in the comments below. A year after the restaurant opened, William's foundation had grown into something neither he nor Grace had originally imagined it would become. It was Grace, not William, who suggested the foundation stop looking only in big cities, because she knew from her own life that the people most likely to give, without expecting anything back, rarely lived anywhere close to a headline. The first person the foundation found under her guidance was a man in rural Mississippi named Samuel, who had spent 11 years quietly repairing cars for free for anyone in his county who could not afford the parts, keeping no records, asking for nothing, simply because his father had done the same before him. Grace recognized something of her grandmother in the way Samuel described his work, and she made sure his story became the second one the foundation told, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. Marcus graduated high school 2 years after the restaurant opened, and instead of choosing a business degree the way several people expected him to, given everything his family had been through, he chose culinary school, telling his mother plainly that he had watched her build something out of almost nothing for his entire childhood, and he wanted to learn how to do the same thing, on purpose, instead of by necessity. Destiny, older now and sharper than ever, began spending her summers working alongside the foundation's small staff, reviewing the stories of people nominated from across the country, and she was the one who eventually convinced her mother and William to add a rule to how the foundation operated, that no recipient would ever be told they were being watched or tested beforehand, the same way Grace had never known. The foundation's third story came from a woman named Charlotte, in a small town outside Tulsa, who had spent 6 years driving elderly neighbors to medical appointments in her own car, refusing gas money every time it was offered, simply because her own mother had gone without rides for years before she passed. The fourth came from a teenager in Detroit named Nathan, only 17, who had been quietly shoveling snow off the walkways of an entire street of retired residents every winter since he was 12, never telling anyone, never asking to be thanked. Grace made a point of meeting each recipient in person whenever she could, and she often said that spending time with them felt less like charity work and more like coming home to a version of her grandmother's kitchen that kept multiplying in places she had never even visited. 5 years after the restaurant opened, Grace was invited to speak at a small community conference in Atlanta, not far from the neighborhood where she grew up, and she agreed on the condition that she would not be introduced as anyone's success story. She stood in front of a room of people who ran food pantries, tutoring programs, and after-school meals out of church basements, and she told them the same thing she had told the reporter years earlier, that the reward was never the reason, and that most of the people in that room would never be found by a car pulling up outside their door, and that this did not make what they were doing any less worth doing. William never became a regular presence in interviews or profiles about the restaurant, and that was intentional. He told a reporter once, in one of the only interviews he agreed to about the foundation, that the moment his name became the center of these stories was the moment he had misunderstood the entire point of what he was trying to build. He said the people worth writing about were never going to be the ones with the money to give it away. They were going to be the ones who had almost nothing, and gave anyway, because giving had never once depended on how much they had left over. Grace still opens the kitchen most mornings herself, even now, even with a staff large enough that she technically does not have to. She still makes one extra plate before the doors open, sets it aside, and waits to see who walks in needing it most that day. She has said, more than once, that the day she stops doing that herself is the day she will have finally forgotten why any of this happened in the first place. Her grandmother Ruth never got to see the restaurant with her name above the door, but Grace kept one of Ruth's old recipe cards framed near the entrance, worn soft at the edges, so that everyone who walked in, whether they could pay or not, would see exactly whose kitchen this had always really been. If there is one thing this story asks you to carry with you, it is this: kindness that depends on knowing who is watching is not kindness at all. It is a performance waiting for an audience, and most of the time, no audience ever comes. Grace never knew William was rich when she fed him, and that is exactly why what she did meant something. The reward was never the reason. It was simply what happened to follow, and most days, for most people, it never comes at all, which is precisely why the choice to be kind anyway is the only part of this story that was ever truly hers to make. Thank you for staying with us through this one. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We genuinely read every single one, and if this story is the kind of thing you want more of, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what we bring you next.